We're going to start the lunchtime discussion. I know the lunch was very delicious. I'll ask the panelists to come up here, and then I'll introduce them. Jim Townsend, thank you. I'll introduce you in a moment. Sherry Goodman, Admiral Zukov, and David Sanger. Why don't you come up to the panel of chairs, and I'll introduce this. So it's a bit of a reunion as well, yes. So first, I want to thank ASRC Federal, right to my left here, for this wonderful lunch. Thank you so very much for providing it. They would like to let you know that they were up all night cooking.
We don't usually eat this well.
This is very good, but thank you so very much. Very generous of you to support this effort. We really appreciate it. This afternoon, we thought we would do something a little different. So we called upon our good friend and colleague, David Sanger, and I literally called upon him and asked him if he would allow us to, infringe upon his day. David's on a robust book tour. If you have not read his book, you certainly should be reading his book. It is a fascinating read, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. Not exactly uplifting, but as David will tell you, the tour is robust for a number of reasons. One is the intellectual capacity within the book, but also what it says about our times that we're currently living in. So David, as the New York Times national security correspondent, I want to thank you very much for taking the time away from your day. I also want to thank you as a colleague and friend, as a Woodrow Wilson Center scholar, where the completion of that book occurred. Thank you so much for allowing us to infringe upon you. David is joined by Sherry Goodman. Sherry is the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. That was her position before. She went on to many more things, but she's currently the Senior Fellow at the Polar Institute. And I infringed upon Sherry's time and asked her to join this panel as well. Sherry, thank you for being here. Admiral Zukov, we've already introduced. But I will say that I thought your second presentation this afternoon really did set up not only this panel the rest of the day, but really tied together the themes that we saw earlier in the day. And then Jim Townsend, and I always get these titles a bit wrong, so you have to endure with me, all right? So Jim is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO. And we thought that was particularly appropriate to have Jim on this panel today, as so much is going on in that area, specifically not just NATO, but standing up a second fleet, the now great power emergence that we see in the Arctic and everywhere else. And Jim is also a global fellow of the Polar Institute. So, David, I want to thank you for leading this bit of a discussion on national security interests in the Arctic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and great to see all of you, and great to be back in this room and back at the Wilson Center. I have actually been here twice as a fellow for my first book and the most recent one, my third book, and it's a terrific institution, a great place to write, a great place to have terrific intellectual fellowship and generations of people who've sort of come by, looked at chapters of mine. Rob did this a lot, Rob Litwack, for the most recent book, and then would come back in on Monday and say, this is really interesting. I think you need to rewrite it. So no, it's a great place for those kind of projects. And it's great to be with such a distinguished panel. You know, since we've all been watching the funeral ceremonies for President George H.W. Bush, and tomorrow, and the lying in state last night and today, I was thinking as I was preparing for this that it's an interesting frame for the problem that we're facing today, and I wanted to start with Admiral Zumwalt, Admiral Zukov on this. Admiral Zumwalt would also be interesting on this, but Admiral Zukov would be really, really interesting on this. That's it. So for Admiral Zukov, if you think about where we thought about this region when at the end of Bush 41's time, when we were still all off in a discussion of sharing the region, keeping it largely non-militarized. Obviously, there was some military activity around the edges of it. And where we are today, a little more than a quarter century after he left office, it's a very different place. And I was wondering if you would just start by telling us briefly how you think we got to this spot, and how you think if we came back here to have this panel again in, say, 5 years, how we're going to be looking at the Chinese, Russian, and American jockeying for position there 5 years from now.
I think we're, for the most part, a reactive nation, and not a lot of, I mean, we'll put some strategic forethought into our areas of emphasis, but more often than not, we're reactive. So what was the wake-up call to the Arctic? And even though not technically in the Arctic, it was the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The logistic challenges, number one, of how do we marshal a pollution response operation up in Alaska. So, wow, this is really hard. We didn't have Northern Command back then either. We had NORAD, but we didn't have Northern Command. So, so what was our outreach with the local community? We didn't have a national contingency plan to deal with oil spills. Not only that, but the whole of government approach in putting what we call an area contingency plan together. So you want to use maybe dispersants, which we did during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Well, you can't do that in Alaska, but we didn't even have the consulting mechanism in place to interact with the affected populace. So I would say that was probably our initial wake-up call of saying, wow, this is really hard. We never thought we would have another oil spill again. And then you have to fast forward to now Shell wants to drill in the Arctic. Just before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the White House under President Obama had lowered the bar, so to say, to offshore drilling. And they said, what are the likelihood that we would ever have another Exxon Valdez again? Answer is probably slim to none until Macondo 252 went up and the Deepwater Horizon, worst spill in U.S. history. On the heels of that, Shell is pumping $5 billion into drilling in the Arctic, doing all of the outreach and on the immediate heels of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And that really energized whole of government and says, whoa, hey, not so fast. And every time Shell would complete an environmental impact study, the goalpost would be moved further back as well. So I would say these were mostly reactive, and now we're looking at Russia. Wow, they've got a lot of icebreakers. Oh, and they're militarizing what used to be search and rescue stations. They're putting icebreaking corvettes. And what's this? Now we have China, and now China's going to have 2 icebreakers, and they're knocking on our door. And what we call the 9-dash line, well, we have our extended continental shelf. And so, again, I call these predictive surprises, if you will, but each one of them has been reactive to what's happening around us. We're reacting to the retreat of sea ice that has now opened an ocean, but the ocean is opened in what I would call somewhat of a strategic void right now.
Well, before I turn to Sherry on that, you brought up the icebreakers. So just to level set us, we have 2 in service now, right? There's been discussion that we should have a fleet of 3 medium and 3 heavies. I don't think we're any place close to that, and Congress has maybe authorized 1 more. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so right now it looks like through the appropriation process, 1 through the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and the DoD appropriation, it puts the Navy on the hook to fund 1. Under the DHS appropriation, there's a 2nd. We completed a high latitude study. It's a 3-volume, it sits almost as high as this chair, study by an independent entity that says the United States needs 6, 3 heavy, 3 medium. GAO.
Russians have what about now?
46.
46. Yeah. Okay.
So we've done ample studies. I could build one out of paper mache with all of the paper that has been thrown at study.
You may have to.
And we go back to the Hill, and they say, we want another study. And then we get our nose rubbed, and all you do is studies, and you're not building anything. Meanwhile, we've got industry waiting on the sidelines and saying, hey, we can build these in the United States, but we're not going to build in fiscal uncertainty and start something that's not going to be completed, lay off shipyard workers. And right now, we only have 5 what I would call Jones Act or deep water shipyards that can build, commercial deep water ships. We don't have a lot of competitiveness in the United States. So this cuts across a number of areas. But yeah, we need to at least start building the first one. It's been 40 years since we laid up steel almost 4 inches thick to build a heavy icebreaker or a polar security cutter.
So, Sherry, take the same question on in the environmental security arena. Think of the era from the end of 41's time in just January 1993 and today.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for being here. I think there's actually 2 complementary storylines from President Bush's presidency back 30 years ago. Actually, Admiral Z, in many ways, told the environmental story of the Exxon Valdez and the U.S. having to cope with an environmental disaster, not in the Arctic, but in Alaska, and coming to grips with addressing environmental requirements. At the same time, at the end of the Cold War, I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff at the time. We were very robustly positioned in the Arctic. During the Cold War, we were prepared to defend the nation against a bolt-out-of-the-blue nuclear attack from the Russians. That's why we had the DEW line sites and many other infrastructure in the Arctic and including with Canada through NORAD. Then Cold War ends, and I led a program in the Department of Defense in the early 90s for the Secretary of Defense on Arctic military environmental cooperation. Just think about that name given the era we're in now. This is 25 years ago. Jim was involved with it. He was also in DOD. Arctic military environmental cooperation. This was a program of engaging the Russians with the Norwegians to help them deal with liquid waste streams from decommissioned Russian submarines that had sunk at the Murmansk harbor, and the Norwegians were deeply concerned that those sunken submarines might contaminate the fishing grounds in their region. So we spent about a decade working cooperatively with Russians and Norwegians. Many of the other Nordic nations and our other NATO allies were also involved to develop technology to offload the liquid waste streams and transport them inland to Chelyabinsk for proper storage. We also did bilateral military environmental cooperation projects with the Russians during that era. Now think about the era in which we're in today, where cooperation wouldn't be the name of a new program we'd give with the Russians today, certainly not in the Arctic. But I think we've heard some very interesting threads even this morning, connecting both the environmental security and the national security domains, in which is important, I think, for us to think through. Both of these are very relevant. Obviously, Arctic change is occurring because of environmental change so rapidly, and more rapid than anywhere else on the planet. At the same time, that's given rise to a new geopolitical dynamic and great power competition. We see China with the opportunity to create now the spider web of its polar Silk Road as it works its way across the Arctic, first for energy and perhaps in the future for fish. So I think we are really in a changed world. What I'd say is that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We got to be able to address our environmental considerations, our national security considerations, deploy a whole of government approach, and work in close cooperation with our allies.
So, Jim, if you take on both of those, but add into it, of course, you spent many years dealing with Europe and NATO on these issues, and after long therapy, you've come out of the
And hair loss.
Yeah,
by the way.
right. That's right.
Well, yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the lunchtime entertainment. So, Mike, thank you very much. But you know, it's interesting when the word came out that President Bush had passed away. I thought of the Arctic because in 1990 I started my work in Europe NATO as an action officer there, and I was doing Scandinavia. Dick Cheney was the SecDef, and my job was helping to lead the delegations to dismantle the dew line, the die sites in Greenland. I went up to Thule a number of times, North Warning, all those sites that were, as Sherry said, so important during the Cold War. I was in charge of closing those, negotiating with the Danes.
I cleaned them up.
And Sherry and I were working with cleaning those and other sites in Europe as the George H.W. Bush administration began that transition. And that's why it's so great that you started with President Bush, because he was this transitional president. I don't think he realized that. No one did when he was elected. But we started there in Europe on a trajectory through the 1990s where we began to shift out of the Cold War mode when it came to NATO and Europe and this type of thing into worrying about other things. And so what we saw, beginning with the dismantling of all those Cold War sites, was a disengagement by the U.S. from Europe and from a lot of what we were doing in the Arctic at the time, whether it was submarines or whatever it might be. We closed Keflavik, NAS Keflavik in Iceland in 1996, the spring of 1996. I was part of that. And so we began to imagine a Europe and a European Arctic different than what we had known during the Cold War. But what we were also seeing was the dismantlement of the muscle memory within the military on how to operate in the Arctic, whether it was ASW, whether it was submarine ops, whether it was all kinds of things that we were pretty good at in 1990. By the time we got into the 2000s, and we had other problems. We had post 9/11. We were in Afghanistan, Iraq, worried about foreign fighters. We were in sequestration, which really accelerated the movement of U.S. forces out of Europe and led to closure of facilities there. So it got us to a point, starting with George H.W. Bush, it got us to a point in 2014 that when the Russians came back, number one, and the Arctic was all of a sudden becoming a place very different than what it looked like in 1990 because of the ice was now melting. We found ourselves having to face an adversary in a part of the world where whatever muscle memory we had was pretty much gone in a lot of ways, and we were having to relearn a lot of things.
But their muscle memory wasn't gone, right? So, I mean, they talk a little bit about why it is that they kept operating. Well, obviously, we were distracted by Iraq and Afghanistan, but other things as well.
In China as well. But it's interesting, your point up there is interesting because not only in terms of the Russian muscle memory, in terms of operating the Northern Fleet, I'll just talk about that. I mean, they were beginning to repair a lot of the disarray that the Russian military had gone into post-Soviet Union days, and in creating cruise missile capability and things like that. But I think to really point the finger of folks who did not lose their muscle memory, and that was the Norwegians. And I think anyone who's dealt with Norway in the past, whether it is ASW, pt3 ops, dealing with the Arctic up there on the European side, that's one of the reasons we did Trident Juncture off of Norway, was that the Norwegians were concerned that they were the only ones in the alliance that knew how to fight up there. And the Norwegians have been saying that in NATO for years as we began to have out-of-area missions in Afghanistan and other places for NATO. They were saying, look, if the Russians ever come back, you know, we're the only ones who are watching them. And so when, in fact, we had the invasion of Crimea and, of course, Georgia before that, the Norwegians came in and said, okay, we got to pull up our socks here, and we all began to once again focus on the Arctic. And I think it was very interesting. Admiral Lewis talked at CSIS about the Second Fleet, and he was talking about that exercise and other exercises where the Navy is kind of clawing back its ability to work in the Arctic, at least in the European Arctic. So.
Let me just follow up on that. So recently there was a NATO exercise, Trident Juncture,
Right.
which was an effort to show that we had at least some muscle, if not muscle memory, that was back there. And if I recall correctly, that was all of NATO. It wasn't, right. So we've been through that. What were the lessons that emerged from that one?
There were some very interesting lessons, I think, for NATO as an organization, also for NATO and also for the nations themselves, including the United States. Ambassador Raji, who was sitting around here somewhere, has been writing on that as well. And I think what was interesting to me, one of the first things I saw was the U.S. Navy encountered sea states that they were not quite used to dealing with up there in the Arctic, to the point where they had some damage to some ships and one had to turn back to Iceland to get repairs. There were also some sailors who were hurt on some of the gales that they were running into up there in doing this exercise. So I think in terms of operating in an Arctic environment, again in the European Arctic, operating up there, doing carrier ops, doing amphibious ops, working with allies up there, there was a lot of lessons brought back on how hard it is. And we've talked about the book, The 1,000-Mile War, and I think that talked about how hard it was in World War II. Well, I think we were kind of relearning a lot of that, and you heard some of the naval commanders coming out of the exercise were talking about having to learn how hard it was to be on a carrier deck, doing flight ops in that kind of cold weather. So that was something, I think, for the U.S. Navy that came back. I think NATO came back understanding that there was still a lot more work to do in terms of comms up there. We know up in the Arctic, comms are difficult, and secure comms are even harder when a lot of the allies don't have secure comm equipment to begin with. So you had that type of thing, as well as mobility issues, dealing with moving land forces from continental Europe, if you will, the lower 48, up to the Nordic countries on road. So there was a ground force exercise as well as a component to Trident Juncture. So we're going to hear, I think CSIS actually is going to have, the Norwegian attaché is going to give lessons learned in a couple days at a presentation. So there's definite lessons coming back, but I think one thing for sure is NATO showed that it could pull off a complex, long exercise, the largest it's had since, I think it was at least since early 2002, the largest exercise. They were able to do it without any major problems that certainly were obvious to us on the outside. And I think that was important for NATO's confidence to show that it could do it.
So, Sherry, when you were on the Armed Services Committee, nobody was discussing a Northern Sea route because nobody could have imagined you could have had one at the time. So tell us a little bit about how that's changed the politics of what's involved here.
Well, absolutely. And neither was anybody discussing environment when I was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So we don't have to go back that far to see how far we've come from these days. I mean, we were not discussing operating at the surface in the Arctic back 30 years ago on the Senate Armed Services Committee with Senator Nunn and Senator Warner and others, but nor were we discussing it in the 90s in the Pentagon. What we've seen is a whole new ocean and a whole new region being created, within our lifetimes, within really the last decade. This has really all changed. The Russians, of course, have long been present in the Arctic. They have the longest Arctic coastline. Much of a significant portion of their GDP is tied to the Arctic. As Admiral Z noted earlier today, now they see the Northern Sea Route as essentially a toll road, the Suez Canal, where they can sort of enhance their GDP as China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and others perhaps transit that Northern Sea Route to get shorter access to those routes in Europe and to procure energy and other minerals. And so we're also seeing significant Chinese investment in Greenland and in Iceland. And I think it, along with the threat multiplier of climate change, making this a region changing more rapidly than elsewhere in the world, this is both unprecedented risk, but I think it's unprecedented opportunity, as we've heard from many of our speakers here this morning, that we can up our game in the Arctic. And I'm actually pleased to hear so many of our U.S. Government colleagues saying that they are really right there doing that.
So, Admiral Z, when we hear the military discussion going on these issues, it's almost always dominated by Russia. But over the longer term, it strikes me we need to be far more concerned about the Chinese because they have the staying power in a way that the Russian economy is unlikely to give. They may not have as many icebreakers, but they've got a lot more economic interest in the route and a lot more ability as Sherry has pointed out, to go co-opt certain areas that they can use as bases for this. I hear almost no discussion in the U.S. of the China strategy element of this. So can you walk us through a little bit? Maybe I'm just listening in the wrong places. Maybe in the Pentagon there is much more of a discussion of this.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking China, we have to look beyond the Arctic, and we also have to look at Antarctica as well, where China is growing its footprint there as well. The treaty for Antarctica will expire within the next 25 years or so, but explicit within that treaty is no resource extraction out of Antarctica. And the U.S. is the watchdog right now. Has there been any resource extraction? Not that we know of, but let's fast forward 25 years from now. As resources, especially rare earth metals, become more scarce, if you follow China, looks like they're cornering the market on that. There will be the OPEC of rare earth metals, hence the interest in Greenland. As that ice retreats, it now exposes soils to extraction as well. So China is clearly in the game, and in a non-transparent way. Where we see them exerting influence, with Arctic nations, namely with Denmark via Greenland and with Iceland as well. They were one of the first to sign on to be observers to the Arctic Council. They are a near Arctic nation, which means they clearly have aspirations for the long term. Northern Sea Route, it cuts 4,500 miles of transit between the Asia and European market. Significant fuel cost savings, time savings, and a just-in-time inventory. And there are some models out there that say as early as 2030, there may be periods where the Arctic is completely ice-free. China is looking at all of those things, but they're doing something about it right now. They're making these investments. My speculation, looking at Russia and China both, is the United States is a sleeping dog right now. And as long as we're going to be a sleeping dog, then let's get ourselves ahead of the game. And let's put the United States in a position where they have to catch up, much like we did when Sputnik went into outer space. So if I were to view how China and Russia view us, I would say they view us as a sleeping dog, and let's take full advantage of this opportunity that we have created for them.
We have about, 10 or 15 minutes left for additional, so we want to make sure to get some of your questions in. I want to start with Mike, since he brought us all here today. And
I get to ask a question.
And to ask a question. And
Okay.
you've got the microphone, so it's even better.
Okay. Well, I didn't expect a question, but sure, I'll take one. And we've got about 5 to 7 minutes or so. So I do want to get some questions
We'll
here.
do quick
We'll
questions
do quick.
and quick
So
answers.
here's my quick question. We've talked about many countries today, but Admiral Zukov, you have highlighted the relationship with Canada through NORAD and other things. So I wonder if you would talk about going forward the relationship between the United States and Canada and how that figures into Jim, your comments, Admiral Z, your comments, and Sherry, your comments, because that is a strategic alliance that we depend on in so many different ways. Perspectives?
I'll take that first. So just over a year ago, we sent a ship from Alaska to Baltimore via the Northwest Passage. Now, we just didn't do it unilaterally. We informed Canada that we were going to do so, and Canada said, well, you're going to need an escort and you're going to need an ice captain, so you cannot do what they thought was a freedom of navigation operation, not an exercise, through the Northwest Passage. So we talk about the Northern Sea Route, but we also have this same rub point, if you will, with Canada and the Northwest Passage. There may be an opportunity where bilaterally, at least U.S. to Canada, we can broker a freedom of navigation clause, if you will, especially for U.S. public vessels, military vessels, as we did with the Panama Canal, where we don't need permission to go through there. But I think that might be a start going forward. But even, as I sit here today, we embark Canadian scientists on our icebreaker to do this very same mapping of the extended continental shelf. We have areas that overlap that Canada says this is ours, and we say no, it is ours. So we have a couple of rub points there as well in terms of some of our extraterritorial claims with Canada. But before we try to broker this with Russia, let's do it with an ally. Let's do it with a neighbor first, and establish that precedent. So I think there is an opportunity in this long enduring relationship that we have with Canada.
Quick one from Jim.
A real quick one. You know, I've worked Canada for many years as well, and we have no greater ally than Canada in so many ways that isn't really seen publicly. But in terms of certainly on the defense side, we're very, very tight. And NORAD, of course, is the centerpiece of that, but it's more than just NORAD. And I think what we ought to think about into the future is that we talk about North Warning, and I'm not sure what the status of North Warning is today, but when I was working North Warning a few years ago, more than a few years ago, it was in bad shape. And to fix up North Warning, which of course is that first line of radar sites to catch something coming over the pole, to work up there and to do the technology up there is a lot of money. And so there's that also. There's air bases that if you're going to catch something coming over the pole, you need interceptors to go up, and that's usually the Canadians. So it's quite a web of air defense that we have with Canada that now, just like what I was talking about earlier, we find ourselves having to do things with Canada that we thought were over with in 1990, and they're not over with. We're in a new place with this a new kind of threat. There's a new technology out there, but the old relationship is there with Canada, thank God. But we have to know, too, that in terms of the Arctic and working with them and things that are Alaskan, we've got that whole northern area, too, that's in terms of the military and defense relationship that's also on our plate and will be calling for a lot of money and resources in the future.
Sherry, did you have something you wanted to?
Well, I agree completely. Canada is, of course, a vital ally to the U.S. overall and also operating in the Arctic. And when you look at the map, as we saw many times earlier today, we actually have a North American Arctic in terms of geography, which does include Greenland. And we should be very mindful that when we think about sort of our alliances in the Arctic as Greenland gains ever more sovereignty from Denmark and has ever more Chinese foreign direct investment and potentially influence in the region, we need to embrace Greenland and ensure that it is part of our conception of the North American Arctic.
We have a question right over there. Hold on just a sec. Somebody's going to bring you a mic.
Thanks for taking my question. I'm Azita Raji, former U.S. Ambassador to Sweden. Admiral, you talked about implementation, and I'd like to ask all of you, who is talking about implementation of all the strategy briefings that go on, of everyone who's interested? Who is thinking about how to get things done? And if no one is doing that, who are the people that we should all be thinking about talking to? Is it the business community? Often incentives are the best way to motivate people to get something done. Is it the grassroots? Do we have some sort of a campaign plan to get people's attention? There are a lot of issues, and how can this become the conversation that people have around their dinner table when they're worried about things, in addition to healthcare and education for their children? How do we elevate this issue? So I'm interested in, okay, this is all great and very interesting and intellectually stimulating, and there's great strategy. What is the strategy for implementation, and how do we talk more about that?
Yeah, so I think we really need to break this down into consumable bite-sized pieces. And so we'll start with a polar security cutter. And in this town, we often simplify. So what does it mean to exert influence in the Arctic? All you need are icebreakers. Russia has 46, we have 2. Okay, so we'll get icebreakers. Well, it's not that easy. How do you get that into the budget? So we've got part of that in the Navy budget. In fact, we've stood up a joint program office, Navy and Coast Guard, that will look at the requirements for a polar security cutter. And oh, by the way, one of those will reserve space, weight, and power if we have to fully arm this with an offensive and a defensive military capability. Unlike the 2 ships that we have right now. One is basically a scientific platform, and the other is just a big bulldozer that breaks ice. And so we're having those discussions right now. More importantly, we're working with our authorizers, and more importantly, the appropriators. We'll see what happens with the 116th Congress. We'll have a new chairmanship of the House Appropriations Committee. So all the legwork, and I spent, I think, 100 congressional dinners in my quarters when I was the Commandant of the Coast Guard, convincing members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, authorizers, appropriators, of why we, the United States, need to invest in these platforms. So that's one bite size. We need to look again at infrastructure. Army Corps of Engineers is on the hook to deliver a report, maybe by the end of the year, but hopefully to be released in the very near future. Who implements that as well? You know, and what would a deep water port look like? What are the funding sources? There is a funding source out of the Harbor Maintenance Fund that's, right now it's got about $9 billion in it. So then how do you start sourcing these? But at the end of the day, you need to integrate all of these investments. Domain awareness. That might be space-based. It might be investments in technology. Who owns that piece as well? You don't want to necessarily have to own this. You know, if this is commercially available, what you need is the data. You may not need the hardware itself. How do you harvest the data? So I'm encouraged that we have an Arctic Security Committee, but we don't have a fully functional Arctic Executive Steering Committee right now to prioritize this is what we need, and we're going to invest in this order. And at the end of the day, this will be an integrated system that will meet all the requirements of whole of government. But I think there's two or three that I would say are you know, prioritized investments that are executable in the very near term. Polish security cutter, domain awareness, and infrastructure.
I think we have time for just one more, if, ma'am, with you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a scientist and I'm also an Alaskan. And one of the things that I've noticed when I'm not staring at equations, because that's what I like to do, but when I'm not doing that, is I think we have an attention span problem in the United States in terms of the national security. So when we talk about the Chinese and the Russians, the Chinese, they have 10, 100-year attention span on presence in the Arctic. Ours lasts about 4 years, sometimes less. So I want to kind of hear what you think strategically, how we can, if we're going to get funding, we need to extend our attention span. So how does that work?
So, Nettie, thank you for that question. And I think you and I have been talking about this for a while, and you and many of the Alaskans and others in this room do take the long view because you're an Alaskan or you live in the region or you've devoted your careers to working on these issues. And we often observe that the Chinese do take the long view in the Arctic and elsewhere. I must say I was very heartened today to hear from our Navy colleague that the new Navy strategy takes a long-term view of presence. Now, okay, we know we've had subsurface presence. That's a long-term view, but I understood that comment to be a long-term view about a whole of Arctic strategy for the Navy, and I think that applies also in the words I think we also heard from the Air Force that you know, it's long been a strategic buffer, but now it's porous. And when porous meaning like open to other threats, and therefore we have to be able to defend against them. So I think that we are moving into a time when there's going to be greater consideration. And I think just as gathering here today, I mean, when I look at the array, and this goes back to the ambassador's question here, you know, the array of both private sector and public sector involvement here today, and thank you to all those private sector sponsors that have made this possible. You know, you're also looking to sort of innovation and the next sort of economic opportunity in the region. And we know the Nordic country, Sweden, where you served as ambassador, has been very innovative at putting forward its communities to sort of take advantage of innovation, whether it's new data centers or space centers, and integrating public-private partnerships. And I know, Nettie, I know you're doing that as well in your own way. And I think with the work that Mike and others are doing here at Wilson, we hope to be, you know, the opportunity to keep that sustained on the forefront of policymakers' mind in this administration and with the new Congress.
Jim, you have the last word at lunch here.
Well, I love that question, and I have thought about that question from the moment I started hearing the speakers this morning, because I witnessed that lack of attention span after 1990, for good reason. I mean, the situation had changed in terms of the threat. We didn't have climate change. What I talked about earlier made it seem like the logical thing for us to do, to have this very big withdrawal from the European Arctic and from Europe and from NATO. We went on to other things, and as I said, we lost the muscle movement, this type of thing, but we also lost political and bureaucratic buy-in by the services to the mission. And so as I was listening to the speakers today, I kept thinking, you know, this sounds so great, this rah-rah Arctic, we're going to be back. I heard, as I said, Admiral Lewis talking at CSIS, we're Second Fleet and Arctic, and I'm happy about that. But I remember 15 years where I couldn't even get a phone call returned, you know, because it's like, Jim, you know, Iceland, we're in Afghanistan now. There's not, you know, like, for God's sake, let's don't close this base. And it's like, you know, and so I know that pendulum can swing again. What's different, though, this time is the threat, if you will, is there, and it's going to be there for the long term. This isn't some, you know, short-term little thing that's just cropped up. So it's going to be there. But to get to the root of your question, we need to develop a constituency within this town. And it's starting right now. As Sherry said, the people in this room, what Mike is doing here at the Wilson Center, on the Hill, the two senators are doing it. What Admiral Z is doing just by his sheer personality and the things that he's talking about here in terms of the Coast Guard, we're building this constituency. And at the end of the day, this is what you need for political power to get budgets done and people to pay attention to the problems up there. So I love that question, and I'm hoping that this time around we're not going to have a precipitate withdrawal, if you will, from one region of the world, only to find that we're having to go back.
Well, I thank you for a great conversation. Thank all three of you for pushing us along here. And Mike, you want to tell us where we're headed next?
Sure, but let me thank ASRC Federal again for providing this venue for us. Extraordinary venue. Thank you again. My thanks to Jim Townsend, Paul Zunkoff, Sherry Goodman, and David Sanger. You cannot get a better panel on these subjects than the four of you. Thank you very, very much. So we're going to go with the sports analogy. We got another audible. We'll start at about 1:15, which means I know it means 1:20, but please, let's start at 1:15. 1:15. We have coffee outside the door provided by our friends at Geo North Information Systems. So we want to thank them again because as the day goes on, we will need it more and more. So we want to thank them. We certainly want to thank Doing Unlimited this morning for keeping us going. And once again, thank you all for not just coming this morning, through the lunch, and now into the afternoon. We'll start at about 1:15. You can snicker where you would like. 1:15. Thank you so much.